Look at Manhattan on a map. It's a narrow tidal island, barely 2 miles wide at its widest point. No farmland, coal, or timber. No room to grow. When the Dutch bought it in 1626, Boston already had a functioning harbor and a commanding head start on Atlantic trade. Philadelphia was the largest city in the colonies, the political and economic center of the entire eastern seaboard. Baltimore sat closer to the interior routes and had its own deep water access to the Chesapeake. By every reasonable measure, Manhattan should have become a mid-tier port, a useful stop on the coast, but nothing more. So how does a narrow tidal island with no natural resources and no room to expand become the most economically dominant city in the history of the Western Hemisphere? The underlying answer isn't the harbor. It isn't the Erie Canal. It isn't even Wall Street. It's what's 60 feet below street level. Look up at the Manhattan skyline and you see 2 dense clusters of towers. A tight pack of glass and steel downtown near the financial district. Then, a gap. A stretch of mid-rise buildings where nothing tall gets built. Then another cluster in Midtown, where the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center rise above everything else. Most people assume that gap is a zoning decision, a deliberate planning choice made by the city. But here's the strange part. The geology wrote it. Beneath Manhattan sits Manhattan schist, one of the hardest, most stable rock formations on the continent. It's roughly 450 million years old, compressed by repeated continental collision, and it runs like a spine through the island. In Midtown, the schist sits close to the surface, within a few feet of the ground in places. In Lower Manhattan, it's accessible within a few dozen feet. The Empire State Building's foundation goes 55 feet down and hits solid rock. Compare that to Chicago, where the skyscrapers don't touch bedrock at all. They're anchored in glacial till, compacted sediment left by retreating ice sheets, with foundation shafts driven deep into soft ground material. The schist is what makes Manhattan's extraordinary density possible. You can build taller, faster, and more cheaply when the stable rock is right there under your feet. And that gap in the skyline? Between downtown and midtown, the schist dips far below the surface, buried under glacial deposits and fill. The engineering required to reach it grows more expensive, so the tall buildings cluster where the rock is shallow, and thin out where it isn't. The geology arranged the skyline. It didn't plan to, it just did. But bedrock alone doesn't explain what happened here. For that, you need to understand what the island is sitting in. New York Harbor is not a harbor in the conventional sense. Most harbors are a protected bay or a single inlet. You get one entrance, one exit, and whatever natural depth the seafloor happens to give you. New York Harbor is something fundamentally different. It's a vast, protected estuary fed by multiple rivers. The Hudson, the Hackensack, the Passaic, the Raritan, all converging on the same deep-water basin at the edge of the continent. It has 2 functional entrances for ocean-going ships. The Narrows to the south, and the East River Tidal Strait to the north, which connects the harbor directly to Long Island Sound. No other major eastern port has that geographic arrangement. Ships working routes from Liverpool or Hamburg could enter from 2 directions depending upon wind and tide conditions. And the depth was already there. The harbor's main channels run naturally deep. Large ocean vessels could arrive without the port spending money on dredging first. Compare that to the competition. Boston's harbor required constant maintenance dredging to stay usable for large ships. Philadelphia's access was choked by sandbars along the Delaware River, forcing ships to offload cargo before reaching the city. Baltimore had excellent depth, but sat roughly 200 miles south of the natural trade corridor, adding time and operating cost to every northbound journey. New York's harbor needed nothing. A ship leaving England didn't need to wait for a tide window, or offload cargo into shallow draft lighters, or navigate through a sandbar maze. It just arrived. That's not ambition, that's geography. And it connects to something larger, something that made this harbor uniquely valuable compared to every other deepwater port on the eastern seaboard. If you've already watched the other video on this channel, Why the World's Money Flows Through One City, you know what comes next. This is just the physical setup for that story. The Appalachian Mountains run from Georgia to Maine in a nearly unbroken wall that separates the eastern coast from the interior of the continent. Every eastern city faced the same fundamental problem. How do you move goods from the interior to your port? Most of them couldn't solve it cheaply. Mountains don't move. But at one point along that entire mountain chain, there's a gap. The Hudson River Valley cuts north from New York City, and it connects to the Mohawk River Valley, which runs west through central New York State. Together, they form the only near sea level passage through the Appalachians between Georgia and Maine. No other major eastern port has a water level route into the continental interior. That single geological accident made New York's harbor worth more than any competitor's harbor, because it came with a back door to the whole continent. The Erie Canal was built through that gap in 1825, and the railroads followed the same corridor. The interior trade flowed east and out through the harbor. But here's what the canal story can sometimes obscure. The gap existed long before anyone decided to dig anything. It was already there. It was waiting. 3 physical accidents: bedrock, harbor geometry, continental gap, converging on the same narrow island. Remove any one of them, and New York is Boston. Put them together, and something else becomes possible. Now look at the island itself. Manhattan is 13 miles long and roughly 2 miles across at its widest. It's surrounded on almost every side by tidal water: the Hudson to the west, the East River to the east, the Harlem River to the north, and the harbor to the south. That shape looks like a constraint. It's also a machine. The tidal currents surrounding the island continuously scoured the waterways, keeping navigation channels clear without the expense of regular dredging. The island's perimeter is almost entirely usable waterfront, the full length of it lined with dockable frontage. But the real advantage was the narrowness. On an island 2 miles wide, every dock is close to every other dock. Goods unloaded on the Hudson side could reach the East River warehouses in minutes by cart. Merchants, banks, brokers, and insurers packed in together because the island's geometry left them no other option. The density wasn't a planning choice. It was a mandate from the shape of the land. At its peak in the early 20th century, the Hudson River piers alone handled roughly 40% of all United States foreign trade. Not 40% of New York's trade, 40% of the entire country's. That number doesn't measure ambition. It measures what happens when geography forces the most efficient logistics arrangement possible into the smallest possible footprint. The costs were simply lower here than anywhere else. But here's what the geography story usually leaves out. The same island shape that made New York the most efficient commercial machine in the Western Hemisphere is now a hard physical ceiling. There is no more land. There is no more shoreline to develop. The tidal waterways that once carried commerce are now barriers to geographic expansion rather than highways. The schist that enabled the skyscrapers has been built to its practical ceiling. Midtown is full. Lower Manhattan is full. And the machine is turning on itself. The extraordinary density that came from island narrowness now produces the most expensive commercial real estate, the most expensive housing, and the most congested infrastructure in the country. Building anything new requires dismantling something old. Every square foot is already claimed. The geography that centered the world's attention on this island now makes it the hardest place in America to build, to change, or to expand. The strange part is that nothing about the underlying geography has shifted. The corridor still exists, the harbor and the bedrock still exist. But the machine is full, and geography can't solve the problem it created. Come back to where we started. Manhattan shouldn't exist as anything more than a mid-tier port. All the obvious competitors, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, had more natural resources, deeper colonial roots, and more room to grow. They lost. Not because they lacked ambition or made catastrophic mistakes, They lost because they didn't have the rock, or the geometry, or the gap. New York didn't win because it was ambitious. It won because the continent arranged itself in a way that made any other outcome almost impossible. If you want to understand how New York turned that physical advantage into financial dominance, the harbor, the Erie Canal, the rise of Wall Street, my other video, Why the World's Money Flows Through One City, covers all of it. I'll link it above. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.